Okay. Here today with Sarah F. Noel. Thank you for being here. I first became aware of you through the internet machine, and I now follow you on your Amazon authors page and also at your website, sarahfnoel.com. And that'll be in the show notes in case anybody else wants to see that. I've looked at a few of a written interview with you and a podcast you did with Hidden Gems Books, which is the Hidden Gems podcast.
Yes.
Interesting, very interesting. I suggest other people go look at that as well. That's available on your website.
Yes, all the links. And this link will be as well.
Okay. And I know that you're originally from London and now a person of the world.
Yes.
So,
yes. I now have 3 passports. I moved from London. It was a somewhat gradual thing, but essentially when I finished university, so when I was in my early 20s, and then I've lived in New York City and upstate New York for the past 30 something years, and then I moved to Grenada in the Caribbean 2 years ago.
Okay. Since on this podcast we talk about creativity and kind of the writing process.
Yeah.
How did you develop your writing process, and what do you do now to get into the mindset of writing?
So I've always been a big reader, and I've always written. I mean, I can't tell you how many, short stories, half finished manuscripts I've got on various computer drives over the years. And it was definitely always a real bucket list item is that I wanted to write and publish a book. And yeah, as I say, I've certainly started and even finished many manuscripts over time. And over the last few years, I've become a big fan of historical mysteries. I just love them. And, I joined up on Kindle Unlimited, which gives you the ability to sort of binge read a lot of these series, which I've started to do. And I really started to develop a point of view on what I liked and what I didn't like in the books I was reading. And as I thought about this, I had an idea for a book I might write. But again, I really sat and I thought about this for a very long time. And then I actually have an actual day job, which is in software sales. And I got laid off just before Christmas last year. And so there is only so many hours of the day one can devote to, futzing with a resume and applying to online jobs. And so I started writing this story. And at the time, I really just had no idea what I was going to do with it. And I wrote it and I wrote it and wrote it. And by the time I had a new job offer, I had essentially written a book. And I thought, well, okay, I now have to actually concentrate on this new job. I certainly don't have the time or the energy to start trying to find an agent. I read up on online publishing on Amazon. And I thought, all right, I can do this. I put the book out there with absolutely no expectations whatsoever and was really surprised when it did well. Certainly did much better than I had anticipated. And people started writing reviews and people said to me, when is book 2? And so I thought, okay, I guess I've got another story in me with the same characters. So, but then I had a job. So I had to really start being quite organized about how and when I could write. And, if you're a writer, inspiration doesn't always strike. But I was reading some line by Stephen King the other day. Actually, someone was quoting it, so I have no idea what the actual line is. But it was something like, he sits down and writes 6,000 words a day or something. And that was really what I decided to do. I'm an early riser, so I decided every morning before work, and I work remotely, so going to work is swapping laptops, and that's it. I was going to sit down and I was going to write something. And so I started doing that. And at the weekends, I write more. And then, of course, as a self-published author, there is the whole machinery of marketing that goes along with that. And I honestly had no idea how much work that was. But what I found is that, in terms of creativity, sometimes I'm more inspired than others. Sometimes in 2 hours in the morning, it's amazing what I could crank out. And other times it's tough, but I do try and do it every single day. And that's worked for me. And now, less than a year later, I'm about to publish book 4.
Yeah. Do you keep a notebook or some sort of, whether you do it on your phone, some electronic device, or a notebook, where if you have ideas throughout the day when you're out in the world, do you write those down, or do you just write when you're focused on writing?
I do. What I've started to do recently, I make very good use of the G Suite tools for writing and for organization. And I found my editor through a site called Readsy, and Readsy has the ability to keep project notes and upload photos and things. So I've actually started doing that as I'm doing research, and I want to keep links and notes in places. But what I also do is I spend quite a lot of time thinking through dialogue. So I will often sort of write an entire scene, almost sort of just thinking about it. And then when I sit down the next day, it's actually surprising how much of it I've sort of thought through, and I write the way I thought about it. So I don't necessarily take notes throughout the day, but I do often think, particularly in downtime, I think about the characters and I think about what I want to happen next.
I know that most of your books are set in like late 1800s London.
Yes.
How is that different when you write about it than you think it was actually back then? Like if you were an 1890s person writing about the 1890s, it would be different than a 2020s person talking about or writing about the 1890s. Do you see much difference in that or nuances?
Yeah, I mean, I clearly bring a modern sensibility to this. I am very interested in the some of the social justice issues of the time, and some of it was a time of great transition in England, indeed in the world. Industrial revolution, the start of people at least talking about, the suffragette movement and things like that. And so there is probably no doubt that some of the issues I focus on and bring into the stories are more important to someone in 2023 than they were to most people in 1897. I mean, people were interested in workers' rights, but people are clearly far more enlightened about the need to have safe working conditions, for example, than anybody really was in 1897. So I'd say that's probably the biggest difference. I suspect that if someone had written these books then, they would not have quite that focus, certainly quite that lens.
Okay. I've done some policing in my life, and I just was wondering how it would fit together with if you were doing an investigation now, because you have the crime mysteries that you're doing, that how you would approach it differently now versus back then. And I think maybe the fundamentals are probably the same. Of course, the technology is different, but
Yes.
in your research for it, how do you go about, how does your character go about investigating?
Well, so the 19th century was interesting because it was when the Metropolitan Police Force was actually started by Robert Peel, Sir Robert Peel, which
Yes.
is why policemen in England are called bobbies, because of Sir Robert Peel. And so there was, by 1897, a pretty well established actual police force, which there certainly hadn't been. I mean, before that, um, there'd been the beginnings of something, but it wasn't for the general welfare of society in the way it had been. And however, it was not what it is today. Technology being the least of it. I mean, fingerprinting technology wasn't in effect in 1897, or even for quite a few years later. So,
Mhm.
all the forensics that we take for granted definitely weren't there. And then obviously the ability, what could be gleaned from an autopsy was very limited. My character, they are not policemen, and they interact minimally with the police. Though in book 4 they do interact with the police a little bit more, and they essentially act as private investigators, for want of a better term. But policing was interesting at this point because it had definitely evolved enough that the hierarchy that we know now in the police force was established then. And I think, a lot, to your point, there was a lot that was remarkably similar once you take away the technology.
Right. Because basically the investigation is just you're solving problems. So whether
Yes.
it's back before Sir Robert Peel and you have the Bow Street Runners and
Exactly.
the hue and cry where you just yell for somebody to help, that they thought it might be a good idea to have somebody there that would actually help. And then, so are all your books right in the end or the beginning of the 1900s, or do they go forward through the beginning of the 1900s?
Well, I hopefully they will if I continue. The 4 books so far are in 1897, and the book that's about to be released is in October of 1897. So the next book will be really at the end of 1897, and then obviously, we'll go over into 1898. But I didn't want to go too quickly.
Right.
I want these characters to evolve and for people to feel very invested in their lives and their relationships, and there needs to be a certain pacing for that, I think.
I signed up on your website for your email list,
Oh, wonderful.
newsletter, I think you call it. And
Yes.
I read the first short story that you have on there, The Dowager Prepares for Battle.
Yes.
And is that a good sample of, is that a part of another book, or is it its own standalone explanation of her picking out her clothing and thinking about weapons and getting her network of information?
So it is definitely, it's supposed to be after book 1. I think it's even after book 2. But nevertheless, it can definitely be read standalone. The Dowager is, I think, my most fun character. I certainly have an awful lot of fun writing her. And what's interesting about her is she is the Dowager Countess of Pembroke, and she is an elderly woman who is a force to be reckoned with. And what I like about her, and actually this goes for my heroine Tabitha as well, is while there had been some progress on women's rights at this point, married women were still basically the property of their husbands. Women couldn't have bank accounts. Very few women went to university, and certainly women of this aristocratic class were seen as nothing more than ways to carry on the line. So the only thing that a woman was good for was for marrying well and then having a son, or even having a couple of sons just in case. And the Dowager, who has lived that life, is a woman of such formidable intelligence that if she lived now, there's no doubt she would be, running the army or something like that. I mean, she would be a great battlefield general, but that has been closed off to her. And so in being part of these investigations, she has found this purpose that she hasn't had before in her life, and she loves it. And but she's very disruptive to these investigations, and my hero and heroine try to keep her at arm's length, though they normally fail because she refuses to be kept at arm's length. And so this short story is really her determining that she doesn't need them. She could investigate on her own. She's been the main force in the investigations anyway. And so this is a little snippet of her, how she might go about, or how she thinks she might go about preparing herself to be an independent investigator.
I get a little Margaret Thatcher feel from her sometimes.
It's funny you say that. I actually hadn't thought that. But you're absolutely right. That's exact. If you could imagine, what would Margaret Thatcher have been if she had been, you know, alive 100 and something years earlier? That's exactly right. A
Mhm.
woman with Margaret Thatcher's personality and intelligence. Not that I was a big Margaret Thatcher fan in terms of her politics, but she certainly was a formidable woman. And a woman like that, who had not had the educational options that the actual Margaret Thatcher had, what might she have done with her life? And that's actually I'm going to remember that. That's a wonderful, wonderful way to look at it. Yes, Margaret Thatcher, very much so.
When you write, do you do mainly typing, like you're on the computer, or do you ever write things out on paper
Oh no,
or some
I
other
have
medium?
the world's worst handwriting. I had bad handwriting as a child, but since we've all been using computers all the time, I can barely sign a check. In fact, I can't even remember the last time I used a pen. I
Hmm.
write everything, so I type everything. And honestly, I think that, I mean, I realize everyone has their different processes, and some people, they need the act of writing to really get their creativity going. But I work in computers. I'm on a computer all day typing, and I'm a good typist, so typing is what I do.
And I guess you use the G Suite stuff for that, or do
Yeah.
you have a particular writing program that you use?
No, I like Google Docs. I like the fact that I can go back and look at past versions. I like the fact that it's automatically backed up. It's on the cloud. I don't have to worry that if my computer dies, I've lost it. I'm a big. I know people have their questions about privacy and what happens to data, but uh, I think if you want to go down that path, then you should not use a computer and should not use the internet or a phone in this day and age. And I'm not quite sure why one thing is considered more worrying. They're all worrying, and we take
Yeah.
that risk all the time because we enjoy the convenience. So I just use the tools.
How do you, when you do your research, do you keep it straight with timelines? Or I found doing historical fiction, I was working on one that I started a couple years ago, and it takes place from 1775 to 1815. And I found that drawing a timeline and seeing what else is going on in the world at that time helped to be able to not only get the history right, but the fictional part to kind of weave it in. So where when somebody reads it, they go, "Oh, did this happen? Did this really happen?" So how do you deal with keeping all that straight?
Yeah, I mean, I have started keeping timelines, particularly as just even my characters' personal timelines. I'm like, wait a minute, I want this to make sense. So when am I saying these different books took place, and how long did each book take? And so realistically, what is the weather at this moment in this book?
Mm.
But you're right. I mean, I really, well, I think you can sometimes take liberties with some things within certain reason. I really want the books to be historically accurate. And so, particularly for the last book, which was about coal mining and workers' rights in the coal mines, particularly in Scotland, I did a lot of research on when, because there'd been a lot of regulatory legislation through the 19th century in terms of, first of all, it was children couldn't go down the mines below a certain age, then women couldn't go down the mine, and these regulations moved throughout the century. And I wanted to make sure that I was being historically accurate around these different regulations, and I read up on the regulations. And so I do my best to try and be um, true to the period and true to what was actually happening. And I love the idea that people might read my books and go, "Oh, did that really happen?" and look things up. I mean, I certainly do that when I read historical fiction. So I think that would be wonderful.
Do you have, and I'm sorry, I haven't read all your books yet,
It's
but
all right.
do you have a time in there where they talk with historical figures, or they're woven into the story a little? I mean, outside of saying the king or queen of England,
Yeah.
but is it?
I haven't yet. I probably will. I mean, there's been a couple of references. So at one point, I make a reference to the Home Secretary, and I use the actual Home Secretary's name.
Hmm.
I haven't, and but I find it interesting when people do. But of course, then you have to be very careful that you are being sort of somewhat true to that person's history. It's an interesting question, and I have thought about it, and I'm not saying I wouldn't, but I'll give you an example. I have a character in this upcoming book, and she isn't a real life character, but she is loosely based on one. And so I did do some research into that historical figure's background, and I pulled elements from it. And certainly in my notes, I will say, she's loosely based on this person, but she isn't that person.
Yeah, I was just wondering if I don't know when Sherlock Holmes's time frame was, but if there was ever like a rivalry between the two. The Dowager seems like she would have words with Sherlock, and maybe just like when I have done the historical fiction parts, it's not really having the historical people speak, but just more of like a passing in the street type thing.
Yes,
Like,
which is sort of what the Home Secretary was.
Right.
This, there was sort of just people around who had just to give the period credibility, and absolutely,
Yes.
I totally
little
agree with
flavor.
that. Some
Yeah.
flavor, exactly.
When you prepare to write, do you have a kind of a pattern that you go through, or do you just get up and start writing, or do you have like a process for that?
I do have a little bit of a process. So as I say, I'm a pretty early riser. I also go to bed very early. So I normally wake up between 5 and 5:30. Sometimes a bit earlier, but that's normally when I wake up. And I am absolutely no good without a cup of coffee. So I will get up, I will make myself 2 cups of coffee, and I'll pop the 2 cups of coffee's worth in it, and I will have my first cup of coffee. And my routine for the morning is that I do Wordle, I do the New York Times connection, and then I read the New York Times. So I like to read the opinion pieces. So I read the headlines and I read the opinion pieces, and I do that while I'm drinking my coffee, and then I start writing. And as I say, I then write. I try and start work about 8. So it depends what time I got up and how absorbing the newspaper was as to how long I write for. But I would consider a pretty good morning if I could have start writing by 6 and write till 8. But yes, that is definitely my routine. I have to sort of go through all those things, and then I'm ready to write.
Do you reread what you wrote the day before, or do you just go right into the next part that you're going to write? How often do you reread what you've written?
No, so what I usually do, while I do use an editor, I make very good use of Grammarly, which I find to be a wonderful tool. And so what I'll normally do is I will write a chapter, and I'll just sort of keep going. And then I will go back and reread the chapter and, look at Grammarly's suggestions for typos or, rephrasing of sentences. And I'll do that before I write the next chapter. And sometimes I do that, depending on how quickly I've written. Sometimes I'll do that right after I've written that chapter. Sometimes I'll do it before I start the next chapter in the morning. But I normally do that. So I try and address sort of chapter by chapter as I go, so that I feel like one chapter is in a halfway decent state before I start on the next one.
And when you write, do you write in the same place all the time? Or if you have like a different type of scene, do you try to change your setting, or is it just...
So I'm very lucky. I have the most beautiful view in Grenada, and we live in a condo at the moment, and I have a terrace, and I always start my day out on the terrace. And in fact, people at work joke, it's, if you have a call with me in the morning, I'll be on the terrace. If you have a call with me in the afternoon, I won't be, because it gets very hot and then I go inside. But I drink my coffee, read the newspaper, and start writing, looking out at my beautiful view of the water and the boats. And that's how I start writing in the morning.
Okay. How do you determine the length of a book? Do you go in with an idea or like an outline, or do you see where it takes you with a general idea?
So I am what I found I've now learned is called a pantser. I didn't know this term before, but I am a pantser,
Mm,
which is basically that you write a book by the seat of your pants. I certainly
right.
don't have an outline. What I will say is, um, I aim to have my books be in the 83 to 88,000 word, around there. Um, I what is interesting is, so I sort of have that. This is sort of what I'm aiming for, but I also don't pad in order to get there. I seem to just sort of organically get to about that by the time I finish telling my story. At least that's what's happened the last 4 times. So I sort of have some end goal, but I certainly don't get to the end, say, well, this is only 70,000 words. I need to, put some padding in, and
Mm.
I don't think I would do that. I mean, clearly, to be a novel, it has to be a certain length, but they just seem to sort of fall into that kind of length, which is a good length for a novel. So I'm not unhappy with that. But I do very much write them by the seat of my pants. That there is no doubt about that.
And I know you said you use an editor for your books. You self-publish them.
Yes.
How'd you start doing that? What made you think I'm going to do that rather than shop the book around?
Well, as I said, it was really more sort of time and patience. I just, I have a career that I enjoy and is not an insignificant career. And so it's amazing I find time to write, let alone to start querying agents and, dealing with that. And I just decided, I'm just going to put this book out there. My dream was to put a book out into the world and have people read it and hopefully enjoy it. And I've done that. And I didn't feel the need to go the traditional publishing route, at least when I started. Um, that wasn't a necessary part of the dream for me. Um, and so I just did what seemed easiest at the time, which was to self-publish it. And as I say, I know a lot of people. There's a lot of self-published authors out there, and I know a lot of them have limited success. I've been very lucky. The books have been really quite successful, and that's just sort of icing on the cake. But that wasn't where I thought I was going with it. I've just been incredibly lucky and pleasantly surprised.
And how long ago was your first book published?
I published it, I think, April 9th of this year.
Oh, okay. Wow. So working on the fourth book within 1 year, when you start writing, do you have a time frame where you're like, this is my goal? Like, are
Yes.
you okay?
Yes.
So
So
you set a goal and go for it.
yes. So I have been ever since. I mean, when I published the first one, I didn't have a goal because I didn't really know if anyone would read the first one. But once I got going, I aimed for one a quarter. And
Oh,
so, and what I do is, and this I've learned that this is a smart thing to do. I, as soon as possible, put the new book up for pre-order on Amazon, so that by the time it goes live, that there's a back order of people who want to get it, which certainly helps with reviews and it helps with Amazon rankings. And so
mm,
I try and have the idea for a book well enough established when I'm coming up towards the end of one book that I can come up with a title, come up with a concept, go to the designer and get a cover made and put something up for pre-order. And so I'm, going for, I mean, I know April isn't, it's a little bit of Q2, but you can tell I'm in software sales. But Amazon was sort of the end of Q1. Amazon. April was sort of the end of Q1. So then
okay.
there was one in April, there was one in July, there was one in September, and then there'll be one in December.
December 22nd is the release
December
date for that.
22nd. Yeah. So I am aiming, at least for as long as I have a whole other career, to try and stick to that schedule. Because I remember, well, I mean, I'm still a reader of the genre. And I really didn't like to wait too long for the next book to come out. So I think
Mm.
that people knowing when they finish one that another one's just around the corner is something I appreciated. And so I'm trying to stick with that.
Yeah, I'd imagine doing the pre-orders kind of also holds you accountable for
Very much
turning
so.
up every day to write.
Absolutely. Because if you don't meet your pre-order, Amazon doesn't let you do it again, I think for a year or something. So
Oh,
yeah. So it very much, and I've been trying to find this balance between I don't want to drive myself insane and give myself an unrealistic deadline. On the other hand, I do want to keep them relatively tight. And so, I finished the fourth book. I'm going back over and editing it. I hope to get it to the editor soon. And then I have a beta reader or an alpha reader, I don't know what you'd call her. And then she'll get it back to me and I'll make whatever necessary changes. And then with Amazon, even though it publishes December 22nd, you have to basically get it to them like 6 days earlier or something. So, I have that timeline. I want to keep that reasonable while keeping it tight.
all right. So when you aren't doing the software sales anymore, do you think you'd up your output or kind of maintain the same?
Oh, absolutely. I would absolutely do that. I mean, I seem to be a
Maintain the
fast
same.
enough writer that I don't know what I'd do with myself if I was only writing 4 books a year. I think I could imagine that I would then go to 8 or something. That absolutely.
I see.
What I
There's
have
a lot of
learned
terrace
through
time in there.
I know. Well, exactly. What I have learned through this process and what being laid off, which I'd never been before, for 3 months taught me is that I am not going to be someone who can just retire and garden or something. I clearly have to be doing something. I don't want to say gardening isn't constructive, but I need to be doing something and I need to have a schedule and sort of something output that I'm creating at the end of the day. So I think that if I've got 2 jobs now and I do 4 books, it makes sense that if and when I finally retire, I'll just double the output, if not more. So that is the plan, but no time soon.
Yeah. Well, I guess it's fortunate then if being laid off can have any fortunate parts
Yes.
that it gave you that little insight
Oh,
of planning for the future.
there is no doubt. I mean, I used to have a podcast myself a while ago called The Impromptu Game Plan. And one of the things it was really about was, sometimes we make choices in our careers and sometimes things are thrust upon us. And that part of, I think, what distinguishes people who have more success in life than others is how they deal with the obstacles that come along. Do you make lemonade out of lemons or, do you not? And while the day I was laid off was pretty depressing, I can honestly look back and say that was the absolutely best thing that happened to me, apart from the fact I got a job that I enjoy much more now. There is no doubt I would not have written this book if I had not been laid off. And so that was very much, in hindsight, the greatest opportunity I had. So, you just have to look at these things and try and make the most of them.
Why'd you stop doing the podcast?
Because I started writing this. Well, that's not the only reason. I was actually writing a book, a nonfiction book, with a friend and ex-colleague, and we started the podcast as a way of sort of an offshoot of the book we were writing. And then my friend became sick and wasn't able to do it with me anymore, and it was far more her subject matter expertise than mine, and so it just didn't make sense for me to keep doing it. And then I started writing my book and then it really didn't make sense. So that's why I stopped.
Do you see yourself ever doing collaborative work again in the future?
That's an interesting question. I guess I like to collaborate in my career, in my, software career. I'm not sure that I could imagine writing a book with someone. I didn't never say never. You never know. But that isn't in the plans, at least.
I've written 2 novellas with another guy, and it does teach you a lot about. It's nice because it holds you accountable because
Yes.
you have to write or they're just going to write the whole thing. So the way we did it was started on Google Docs and ended by using Dabble, because it was just, I think we found it friendlier for, you could see, like, we could be on there writing at the same time and you
Okay.
could see what the other person's writing.
Good.
And it teaches you a lot about scheduling, and then about thinking about your idea. So you have your whole, have an outline of how you think the story is going to go. Not exactly like the seat of your pants type writing, but it's definitely not an outline so detailed. You end up with just chapters first, and then you say, okay, that the story is going to start here. Maybe this is the main event, and let's go with that. So we were doing a books series that were made for Kindles, with the idea that when you start reading, it's not 8,000 pages on Kindle. When you start looking at that and you're like,
Yeah.
man, I'm never going to finish this. So something that could be a little bit quicker to read. And the way we did it was, he would do a chapter, I'd write a chapter. He'd do a chapter, I'd do a chapter. And you really have to adjust, because you're going with someone else's general idea is the same, but things can change, as you know, when you're writing, because you have that, you're discovering what is happening in
Yeah.
the story as you're writing it. That's the best kind of writing, is when you're just, the story is writing itself and you're like, oh, I didn't know,
100%.
I didn't know
100%.
that was going to happen. I had no idea this person was going to come in and say that.
No.
So
And I love it when that happens. I mean, I will
yeah.
say, so I have two daughters, and one of them is in London, and she actually works as a sort of personal assistant to me a day a week, and helps me with social media and other things with the book. And I will often bounce ideas off her. And I found it very helpful on multiple occasions to talk through, particularly when I have some real knotty plot issues. And I talk it through with her. And I mean, if nothing else, the act of saying out loud can be very helpful. But then, she's given me some interesting things that, even if they didn't end up being the thing I wrote, they sort of got me thinking a different direction. So I like that kind of collaboration. I'm less sure about writing with someone else, but I can see how it has its value.
Yeah, it's tough when it does teach you how to let go of the control a little, because if somebody's like, well, I kind of saw this happening, and you're like, oh, well, okay, let's go with that, instead of just being so tightly to it that you can't let go. But I
Yeah.
think it does help with the books that we did. It was his premise, basically. So that helps,
Yeah.
because I'm not going to get somebody else's premise and then say, no, this is how it's going to
Yeah.
go. I deferred to him a much more than I did to myself. But I did like collaborating, but it also makes you go, oh, I do like writing on my own as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's another one of those
I
little things
would
that keeps
say,
going.
I mean, partly because of control, partly because, I do another job, and so I have to do this when it suits me. At least for the time being, I like writing by myself. So we'll see whether that changes, but I don't think so anytime soon.
When you get your alpha or beta reader or whatever it is, I just call them an ideal reader. So
Yeah.
it's a person that you trust opinion enough that you want to listen to it.
Yeah.
That I usually get a draft together, and hopefully it's as close to the final draft as possible, because you don't want to send out something that's
No.
not coherent. So you get your close to final draft, and then you send it off to however many people. It's exciting, because as soon as you send it, you're like, man, I hope they read it and send it back soon, because you want to know what they think about it. You want that feedback, because you have been doing it by yourself for so long
Yeah.
that you're just like, I don't know if this is going to work. I mean, you like it, and you've had those moments where it's writing itself and you're interested in the story, but is somebody else going to be? And then you get, I usually send hard copies out and ask them to just write in the margins of it. And when I do that for other people, usually I'll have different color pens, and it gets a little in depth, because you're actually reading it for the, I'm just a reader. And then you're also putting notes in, usually like grammar and things like that. Unless it's some huge deal, I probably won't do anything with it. Or maybe I'll just put a line by it or something. But usually it's more of comments on, oh, I like this section. Well, that's a good line. What if this happens? And then if you get confused, I would use a different color to say, these are my comments. These are things that I'm confused about, or story issues where, isn't this person dead already? How come they're still talking here? But I take that seriously when somebody asks me to do it, just because I know how much I look forward to it when I send it off to someone. Is how, when you send it off to those readers like that, is it something you just talk to them about, or is it something you get back from them, whether it's a document on a email or a hard copy?
So, excuse me, the woman who kindly does this for me, this started because I have something in my book that says, if you find any typos, please send them to me. And she kindly did. And, people send typos, and sometimes it's like, okay, there's an A missing. Where is there an A missing? You've got to give me some more context than chapter 7. You've missed this word. And this woman gave very clear and useful notes. And
Nice.
so after she'd done it for me, twice, I said to her, look, you're buying the books and doing this, and you clearly enjoy the books. Would you have any interest in doing this? And I will just send you a pre-published version and do it then. And she said she'd be happy to, which is, I'm very appreciative of. So when I work with the editor, he does do not a lot. He does a very nice job of saying, I think you'd build the tension if you change this line a little bit, and I think you should expand on this a little bit. By the time it gets to her, she's mostly saying, I think that's you're using the wrong word there, or you said call this character this here and this there, and then she'll just send me again a list of very easy to follow notes, which I'm extremely grateful for.
Okay. That's the only person you use that for? You don't have like a set of people you send it out to?
Which I know is unusual. I know that. I don't want to sound arrogant about this. And
Oh, okay.
But I haven't done that. It's worked pretty well for me so far. And so if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Yeah,
that's my process.
I don't think it's something people need to do. It's just if it's available, because it's hard to find people that'll actually read it that you care about
their opinion. Exactly.
Care enough about. Yeah.
And that's partly why I don't do it, because, I mean, I belong to a bunch of writers groups and self-published writers groups on Facebook, and periodically people will post something and say, what do you think of this? And everyone's got an opinion. Everybody. And sometimes, I mean, it's not that those people and their opinions are wrong. It's just like, you send it out to 20 people, you get 20 opinions. And I'm not sure that, I'd have to know people and feel like I actually care what their opinion is. And whereas with this woman, over time, I've sort of come to learn I do value her opinion. And so my feeling is my story is not for everyone. My writing's not for everyone. And if, it's not, it's not. I don't need to have a million different opinions telling me what they think the story should be. Yeah. Which is not to say I don't get emails with people trying to tell me that, but everyone's got an opinion.
I feel like your reader is going to end up as some sort of influence on a character in a book eventually.
Well, every so often.
I wonder if she'll recognize it.
Yeah, I'm not saying people haven't made comments which I thought hard about and like, you know what, that's actually right. I should sort of try and in the next book correct something, or sort of they were right. I should have said something about that. So it's not that people's opinion when they write to me I don't take into effect, but but in terms of characters, I mean, I do have friends and family who say to me, can I be a character in the book? And I usually do it. If nothing else, I find it to be wonderful inspiration. So book 4, I have a very, very colorful friend called Chris, who I love dearly, but he is a character. And he is a big fan of the books, and in fact is probably the Dowager's biggest fan. And he wanted to be a character, and he wanted to be named his name. And so he is a major character in book 4, Christopher Kit Bailey. and he's had me send him a few snippets because he can't wait to see how he's portrayed. And so far, he's enjoyed them. But I have said to him, you know what? Be careful what you wish for, Chris. You don't get to control what happens to this character. He's like, oh my goodness, what have I done? I said, exactly.
Yeah.
What have you done? But I think he'll be happy in the end. So I do find that real people can be a great inspiration to me.
I do in my writing a lot. I use the personality of dogs that I've known.
That's a great one. I like that.
So when people that I know that also knew those dogs read it, I think they can tell. But it's it's a word on those writing groups. I think the issue is when you get so many opinions from so many different places, it's good. I like to hear the different opinions, but at some point it takes up so much space in your brain that you start to, it
second guess
influences
everything.
you in the incorrect way.
Exactly. And that's what I don't want to have happen. I have a story, I have a voice. It seems to be that there are enough people who enjoy that. And I don't want to muddy that with other people's voices and opinions. I think there has to be a certain purity of this is my vision.
Mm-hmm. Those writing groups I found more useful for me of just listening to what other people say about other people. It's like watching. So except you can hear the comments and just thinking, you learn a lot about them just based on their personalities or their answers. So that often ends up in the story too. You can use that to influence a character. But I've always found that those are better to meet strange people because I like talking to strange people.
Yeah.
And usually they're in groups like that. Sometimes they're so strange you can't make the connection with them because that's just how some of them are.
Yeah.
But it's also useful if you're trying something new, just as like a little sample of how to do dialogue tags or assign words to people in a book, to where you just do a short thing. I'm not talking about 1,000 words. I'm talking about maybe 200 or 300, just a little conversation between two people, and then just see if it's easy to follow or if it's, I go through a lot of just getting worried that I say, he said, she said too much.
Yeah.
And I know the advice of the greats like Stephen King is just say, he said, she said. And if you have to say it over and over again, that's okay. Don't embellish it too much to where it's, the LY words or wherever.
Yeah.
That I like that, but I also like a conversation that you can tell what the person's saying just by reading what they say.
Yeah.
And then every now and then you put the dialogue tag in just as a little landing spot or landing point is what they would say in the reading groups.
Yeah.
But I just want it to be more fluid when you read it than looking at the scaffolding of what you have to look at in order to read it.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I found that script writing I just started doing it, just practicing script writing. Definitely sets apart. It's a different type of writing. I always thought when people say, my book is going to be turned into a movie, but they have to get it written into a script. I'm like, oh, it's the book. It's right there. And the script is more of instructions than anything else, but it still reads nice because you can kind of let the dialogue tags fade into the background because it's just there. And this person says this, kind of in high school when you're reading a play and it has the person's name and then what they say. I thought about writing a novel like that. I'm not sure if it would be taken well. So that's one of the things you'd go to one of those reading groups and say, what do you think about this? And then see what happens.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought about writing a script for any of your characters for either, for screenplay?
Well, it's interesting. I would say as I've been writing, I've realized, and this doesn't really surprise me because this is both what I am as a reader. I don't enjoy reading overly flowery, descriptive prose. If there's like 2 paragraphs of description about, a tree, I'm not interested in that. I like to get to dialogue and move a story along as a reader. And that is definitely how I write. So, I try to describe things when I think, you want to paint a picture. You want people to imagine, okay, I'm saying this book's set in Edinburgh. What did Edinburgh look like in 1897? But I certainly am far more dialogue driven in my prose than perhaps other writers. And so I actually think it wouldn't be very hard for me to take my books and turn them into a screenplay, because I think they're already very dialogue driven. And I certainly would enjoy doing that. I would not be averse if someone ever wants to make it into a TV show. I'm happy to write the script. Let me just put it that way.
Nice. Yeah. I found like explaining the scene for a script, all you do is say exterior, night, garden, and then you go with your dialogue.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
And I
write a little bit more than that, but I definitely don't have, I write a lot more dialogue than I think some authors do. And certainly the dialogue, I think, drives the prose, rather than the other way around.
Yeah. I like good dialogue. I feel like that's also the part of writing where it takes off on its own, because
Absolutely.
the character is developed in your mind. The mind of the writer, the character is probably developed much more than the reader will ever understand, than anyone else will ever understand than the writer.
Very much so. And the thing is, I am not a visual person. I have very little sort of design skill. And so, some people, we did many years ago, did renovations on a house, and I was utterly unable to visualize. I remember going to a tile store and looking at all these tiles, and like, I cannot imagine what these tiles would look like if a whole bathroom was tiled in them. I don't have that kind of brain where I can just sort of see things. And so it is quite hard for me to imagine a scene that I haven't actually witnessed and then describe it, because that's just not. But I can very, very easily imagine dialogue. That is very easy for me. I can imagine how people think and talk. I just can't imagine what they look like and what they're wearing. So that is definitely my bigger challenge, which is why I often like to go to places that I'm writing about, take photos, so I can then say, okay, I can describe this place because I've been there and I've seen it, and I can look at a photo and I can describe it. So yes, I like dialogue.
It is interesting. You can tell. I'm not sure how well it is. Here's the example: is when I was growing up, went to church, read the Bible, and it talked about shepherds watching sheep in the field by night. And what I pictured was a big grassy meadow, and the shepherds out there with their flowing robes and the big crook sticks, to shepherd the sheep along. And the weather was always nice. And then you go to the Middle East, where there's shepherds watching their sheep in the field at night, and it is mainly dirt with a little bit of grass type bush.
There aren't a lot of nice meadows in the Middle East. No.
Yeah. And it's 130 degrees, and you're like, wow, how did I picture this? And this is the reality of it. So I wonder how many times maybe that's why Hemingway was such a big deal at the time, because he just explained the traveling and the scenery regularly to people, that if you go to a place and then you write about it, I wonder how many people go, that's not like that, because they've never been there, and that's just not what they pictured it as. So
yeah, no, that's true. That's true. I have enjoyed doing some geographical research for the book and going to places, and particularly book 3 was set in Scotland, and we went to Edinburgh and to the Highlands, and then book 4 is set in Brighton in England. I know Brighton pretty well. In fact, my father was born in Brighton, or he grew up in Brighton, and I have good friends who live in Brighton, and we went to visit these friends in Brighton and went to a lot of the places that I then wrote about in the book. So whether or not people believe that's what Brighton is like, that is actually what Brighton is like.
Yeah, I wonder how many people will read that book and then say, oh, I'm going to go to Brighton just to see these parts in the book.
Oh, I hope they do that.
And then it's different than what they imagined, and they're like, oh, okay, you get the legit points for this is really
I mean, I think we always, as readers, I mean, it's part of the reason, if you're a reader, you enjoy reading, is because you conjure these worlds in your mind based on someone's words, as opposed to seeing a movie where, you see a movie and it's all laid out for you. This is what people look like. This is what they're doing. This is where it's set. Whereas a reader, someone puts words on a page and then you conjure these worlds. And there is always probably the high likelihood that those worlds are not exactly what the writer had conjured in their mind, and not even necessarily exactly what the reality was. But I would like to think that most people reading realize that they are unlikely to have imagined exactly the correct scene.
Yeah, I find that with poetry a lot, where you write it and it means something to you,
Yeah.
and you visualize it in a different way than anyone else ever will. And so when people say, "What is this about?" I'm reluctant to explain it because I don't want to ruin whatever they think it's about.
Yeah. Well,
And
isn't
I
that the whole
also,
point? Yeah.
to ruin what they think about it,
No, isn't the
or
whole
uh,
when you read poetry, what it means, to some extent, what it means to you?
yeah, well, to the person writing or to the person reading, or
Both.
both?
Both.
Yes, I think so. I like the idea that in a book, like a novel or something, it's similar, but I feel it more with poetry, where once that's out there in the world, it's its own thing. So I wouldn't go back and change huge parts of a book unless I was doing like, oh, there's a word that's wrong, or I
Oh,
need to close
exactly.
a quotation
Absolutely.
or something like that. But
Absolutely.
I think it's its own thing out there now. I wouldn't want to change it. And
Hmm.
certainly I feel that more with poetry, where somebody says, well, I don't get it. And you go, well, you don't get it.
Yeah.
Or what does it
Okay.
mean to you? And then they explain it and you go, okay, that's great.
Yeah. No, look, I always find it interesting to I don't read all the reviews, and that way does lie madness, but I do sometimes read some of the reviews. And sometimes people have read very different things into the book than I perhaps intended. And who is it for me to say they're wrong? I mean, that's what that character is like to them. That's what the character is like to them. They see a character, and maybe they've seen things that I didn't really realize, that I go back and I think, yeah, maybe there's some truth to that. Maybe that is really what was motivating that character, and I hadn't really considered that.
Hmm. So then that gets to a deeper question of, where do you think ideas come from?
Oh, well, I mean, I as I say, I am somewhat inspired by people saying to me, make me a character. And when I start to think about that, suddenly my imagination takes over. Um, Sometimes going to a place. So, this trip to Brighton was particularly inspiring. My dear friend Charlotte, who lives in Brighton, who is a big fan of the books, had planned this whole itinerary. And she's like, we should go here, we should go there, you should see this. And it wasn't until I went to the place that I'm like, suddenly like, this would make a great spot. And there's a place called Devil's Dyke in Brighton, which you get this beautiful view over the South Downs out in the countryside. And she said, we should go there. I'm like, okay. And I really didn't have any idea what I might do with that until we got there. And I was looking out over the landscape, and there was there's a group called the National Trust in Britain that manages all the public lands. And this is a National Trust spot. And so they had got a little stand set up with some information about the history of the area. And as I was reading that, suddenly a fully formed idea came to me of how
Nice.
this was going to, and now it's a pivotal part of the book. And so, sometimes ideas come out of nowhere. Sometimes they come out of left field. Sometimes somebody suggests something, and then I think what it normally is when someone takes me somewhere, or I visit somewhere, or someone says, make me a character. It's a launch pad to where I then take that. Even my character Kit Bailey in this book. I mean, he certainly has some overlap with my friend Chris, but he was more an inspiration for fun I could have with this character. And so, that's where my ideas come from. I mean, other people, I'm sure, have different ways of being creative, but that's how I am.
Nice. So this fourth book, as we talked about before, comes out December 22nd.
Yes.
And you can pre-order it now on Amazon.
Absolutely. Absolutely. An inexplicable woman. Yes.
Do you do Kindle and softcover?
I do Kindle and paperback.
Paperback. Yes. I know they have the hardcover option now. I haven't done any of that myself.
I haven't done that either.
I don't know if I don't see how it would be any different formatting. So,
well, I think it is because they tend to be bigger books. I might go back and do it. Something I've done recently is I did an audiobook of book 1, and I wanted to do it because I had a few people ask me. And I paid for a narrator, and she's very good, but it wasn't particularly cheap. And so I thought, well, let me do one and see. And if it works, it works. And if it doesn't, it doesn't. And I will say they sell slower than the ebooks. I have now, this is probably 2 months in, and I have recouped the investment. So it was worth doing. And actually now I'm doing book 2. But I didn't know that until I did it. So, the hardback may be the same thing, which is, there's a not very big investment, but some investment in time, and the designer has to change the cover. So, there's some investment. Maybe I do the first book, see whether it pays for itself. Are there enough people out there that buy hardback books these days? I don't know. Maybe there are. I don't know. I've thought about doing it. I may indeed go back and do it. I haven't done it yet.
Yeah, I like the idea of you finish your series or a section of the series, and then you can do a hardcover version of it. Yeah. And maybe you get the spines of those books to all match up to be some sort of picture.
That's a nice idea.
I've seen some sets like that before. And then it's something to look forward to in that time of, I really like these books. I like them so much. I'm going to buy them again. And this is going to be a decoration. It's more of a
that's a great marketing idea. I will consider that. Absolutely. So,
any concluding thoughts? I don't want to keep you from the terrace too long.
It is true. I have more writing to do this afternoon. Today is the weekends. I very much devote to writing, and I have a whole bunch of great nieces and nephews coming over tomorrow, so I won't get a lot done then. Just that, I very much appreciate the people who do read the book. If you're listening to this, I'd love to think that you're interested enough to go and investigate the book. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Yeah, thank you very much for taking the time out to talk. It's
my pleasure.
I liked reading your short story. I will read your books coming up too.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks for being here, and I'll talk to you in a minute after this, okay?
Okay.